The bullet tore through Laura Emerson's shoulder just as the stagecoach lurched sideways, throwing her against the splintered wood, as screams filled the hot Texas air, and the smell of gunpowder choked her lungs. It was September of 1878, and Laura had been traveling from San Antonio to Aurora, a small but growing cattle town in the northern reaches of Texas, seeking refuge with her late mother's cousin after the death of her father 3 months prior. The stagecoach had been her last hope, purchased with the final coins from selling their modest farm outside Austin. Now bandits surrounded them, their faces covered with dusty red kerchiefs, their revolvers glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. The driver slumped forward, dead or unconscious. Laura could not tell which. The other passenger, an elderly merchant, had his hands raised high, trembling as he offered his pocket watch to the nearest outlaw. Laura pressed her hand against her shoulder, feeling the warm blood seep between her fingers. The pain was extraordinary, radiating down her arm and up into her neck, making her vision swim with dark spots. "This one's got nothing," one of the bandits said, rifling through her small carpetbag and tossing her few belongings onto the dusty ground. A worn Bible, 2 simple dresses, a photograph of her parents. Everything she owned in the world discarded like trash. Then came the thunder of hooves, rapid and purposeful. The bandits turned, weapons raised, but whoever approached came too fast. Gunshots cracked through the air and Laura ducked low, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. She heard men shouting, horses whinnying, and the chaos of a fight she could barely comprehend through the haze of pain and fear. When silence finally fell, she dared to look up. 3 of the bandits lay motionless on the ground. The others had fled, their horses kicking up dust trails as they disappeared toward the horizon. Standing beside the stagecoach was a tall man in his mid-20s, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of a summer storm. He holstered his revolver with practiced ease and immediately moved toward her. "You are hurt," he said, and his voice carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence that had just transpired. "Let me see." Laura tried to pull away, tried to say she was fine, but the world tilted dangerously and she found herself being supported by strong arms. "I can manage," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. "My name is Preston Irving," he said, carefully examining her wound. "I have a ranch about 2 miles from here. You need a doctor, and the nearest one is in Aurora, still 15 miles north, but I can tend to this if you will let me." "I do not want to be a burden," Laura managed, even as her strength faded. "The stagecoach, I need to reach Aurora." Preston looked at the dead driver, then at the elderly merchant who was gathering his scattered belongings with shaking hands. "This coach is not going anywhere today, miss. What is your name?" "Laura. Laura Emerson." "Well, Miss Emerson, you have a bullet in your shoulder that needs to come out and you are bleeding considerably. I am no doctor, but I have dealt with my share of injuries on the ranch. Please, let me help you." The merchant approached, his face pale. "I can ride one of these horses to Aurora, fetch the sheriff and a proper doctor." Preston nodded. "That would be wise. Tell them about the attack and that I will be at the Irving Ranch with this young lady. Dr. Morrison will know where to find me." Laura wanted to protest again, to insist that she could wait, that she did not want to impose on this stranger, but the world was growing darker around the edges. She felt herself being lifted, heard Preston speaking in low, calming tones, and then she knew nothing more. She woke to the sound of water being poured, and the smell of something clean and medicinal. The room around her was simple but well kept, with whitewashed walls and a window that let in the golden light of late afternoon. She lay on a bed with a patchwork quilt, and her shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. "You are awake," Preston said from across the room. He approached with a basin of water and clean cloths. "The bullet went clean through. That is good fortune. I have cleaned and bandaged the wound, but a doctor should still examine you. The merchant rode out an hour ago. Help should arrive by tomorrow morning." Laura tried to sit up, but the pain stopped her. "You should not have gone to such trouble. I am nobody, just passing through." Preston pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat down, his expression serious but kind. "You are a person who needed help. That is all that matters." "But I have no way to repay you," Laura said, and she hated how her voice trembled. "I have nothing to offer in exchange for your kindness. I cannot even pay for a doctor's visit." "I did not ask for payment." Tears pricked at Laura's eyes, tears born of pain and exhaustion and the overwhelming weight of loss that had followed her since her father's death. "You do not understand. I have been a burden my entire life. My mother died giving birth to me. My father spent 20 years struggling to make ends meet, working himself to death trying to provide for a daughter who could never quite contribute enough. And now I am here, bleeding in your home, taking your time and resources, and I have nothing to give in return." Preston was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those storm-gray eyes. Then he said very gently, "Miss Emerson, you are not a burden. You are a blessing." Laura stared at him, certain she had misheard. "How can you possibly say that? This morning, I woke up believing I would spend the day mending fences and checking on cattle, the same as every other day for the past 3 years since I took over this ranch from my father. It is good work, honest work, but it is lonely. Then I heard gunshots on the road and I rode out to help because that is what any decent person would do. And now you are here, and I have been reminded that there are things more important than fences and cattle. There are people who need kindness, and there is value in being able to provide it." "That is very generous, but—" "No, let me finish," Preston said, and there was something in his voice that made Laura fall silent. "My mother died 2 years ago. My father passed last winter. I have been running this ranch alone, with the help of a few hired men, and I have been so focused on simply surviving that I forgot what it means to truly live. You arriving here, even under these terrible circumstances, has reminded me that life is more than work and solitude. So please, do not speak of being a burden. You are giving me a purpose beyond my daily routines, and that is a gift." Laura did not know what to say. She had spent so long believing herself to be an obligation, a weight that others carried out of duty rather than desire, that his words felt foreign and impossible. Yet the sincerity in his eyes could not be denied. "Rest now," Preston said, rising from the chair. "You have lost blood and endured more than anyone should in a single day. I will prepare some broth for you, something gentle for your stomach. Tomorrow, when the doctor comes, we will make sure you are healing properly." "And then," Laura asked, "where will I go?" "You said you were traveling to Aurora. You have family there, a cousin of my mother's. I have never met her, but she wrote to me after my father died, offering me a place to stay. I do not even know if she still expects me." Preston nodded slowly. "Aurora is not far. When you are well enough, I will take you there myself and make sure you are safely delivered. Until then, you are welcome here." Over the next several days, Laura learned that Preston Irving was a man of quiet integrity. The doctor arrived as promised and confirmed that Preston had done an excellent job tending to her wound, though he insisted she remain in bed for at least a week to allow the injury to begin healing properly. Preston moved through the house with an easy competence, cooking simple but nourishing meals, changing her bandages with gentle hands, and never once making her feel like an inconvenience. The ranch itself was modest but well maintained, with about 200 head of cattle, a small stable of horses, and 3 hired men who lived in a bunkhouse near the main barn. Preston introduced her to them when she was finally able to sit up and move to a chair by the window. Their names were Samuel, Joseph, and young Thomas, who could not have been more than 19. They were polite and respectful, tipping their hats to her and welcoming her with genuine warmth. "Boss does not often have visitors," Samuel said with a grin. "It is good to see another face around here." As Laura grew stronger, she began to insist on helping with small tasks, despite Preston's protests. She could not sit idle while he worked himself to exhaustion caring for both her and the ranch. At first, it was simple things like mending his shirts, which she noticed had several tears and missing buttons. Then she began preparing meals, working one-handed at first, then gradually using her injured arm as the pain subsided. "You should be resting," Preston said one afternoon, finding her in the kitchen kneading bread dough. "I have been resting for nearly 2 weeks," Laura replied. "The doctor said gentle movement would help with healing. Besides, you have done so much for me. Please let me do this." Preston leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "You still think you owe me something?" "I think that accepting kindness does not mean I cannot offer it in return," Laura said carefully. "There is a difference between obligation and gratitude." A smile tugged at the corner of Preston's mouth. "That is a fair point." They fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks. Laura's shoulder healed steadily, and she found herself settling into life on the ranch in a way she had not anticipated. She discovered that she enjoyed the work of running a household, the satisfaction of seeing Preston and his men eat hearty meals after long days in the sun, the quiet pleasure of keeping a home clean and welcoming. But more than that, she found herself drawn to Preston himself. He was nothing like the few young men who had courted her back in Austin, those who had looked at her father's struggling farm and decided she was not worth the trouble. Preston saw work not as a burden but as a privilege. He spoke to his cattle with patience, treated his hired men with respect, and moved through the world with a steady kindness that Laura found increasingly attractive. One evening in early November, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Texas hills, Preston said, "You have been here over a month now." "Yes," Laura said softly. "I know. I should send word to Aurora, to my mother's cousin." "Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Laura looked out at the golden landscape, at the ranch that had somehow become familiar, at the man beside her who made her feel valued in a way she had never experienced before. "I do not know," she admitted. "When I left Austin, I thought I knew exactly what my life would be. I would go to Aurora, live with my cousin, perhaps find work as a seamstress or a teacher. I would make myself useful so I would not be cast out. I would be grateful for whatever I received and ask for nothing more. And now I think perhaps I was aiming too low," Laura said, surprising herself with her honesty. "You told me I was a blessing, and at the time I thought you were just being kind. But these weeks here, working alongside you, sharing meals and conversations and quiet evenings like this one, I have started to believe that maybe I could be more than just a burden someone tolerates." Preston turned to look at her fully, and in the fading light, his eyes were intense. "Laura, you have never been a burden to me, not for a single moment. If anything, I have been selfish in keeping you here." "Selfish? How?" "Because I should have taken you to Aurora weeks ago as soon as you were well enough to travel. Instead, I kept finding reasons to delay. One more day to make sure your shoulder was healing. One more week to build up your strength. The truth is, I did not want you to go." Laura's heart began to beat faster. "Why?" Preston reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Because somewhere between pulling you from that stagecoach and watching you bake bread in my kitchen, I fell in love with you," The words should have shocked her, but instead they felt like coming home. "Preston, you do not have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I know you have been through so much loss and upheaval. I know I am just a rancher with a modest spread and a quiet life. But I want you to know that if you stayed, if you chose to make a life here with me, I would count it as the greatest blessing I could ever receive." Laura felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. "You truly mean that? Every word?" "Then I need you to know something too," Laura said, squeezing his hand. "I love you, Preston Irving. I think I started falling for you the moment you called me a blessing instead of a burden. You made me believe I could be something more than an obligation. You made me want to be brave." Preston stood and gently pulled her to her feet, mindful of her still healing shoulder. His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away her tears. "You are the bravest person I know." When he kissed her, it was tender and full of promise, a kiss that spoke of new beginnings and hope for the future. Laura leaned into him, letting herself trust in the strength of his embrace and the sincerity of his love. "Will you marry me?" Preston asked when they finally parted. "I know it is fast, but I am certain of my feelings. I want to build a life with you, to wake up every morning knowing you are here, to grow old together on this land." "Yes," Laura breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed 3 weeks later in Aurora, in a small church with wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. Laura's mother's cousin turned out to be a warm woman named Margaret, who wept with joy at the ceremony and welcomed Laura into the family with open arms. Samuel, Joseph, and Thomas stood as witnesses, their faces beaming. The doctor who had treated Laura's wound attended with his wife, pleased to see his patient not only recovered but radiant with happiness. Laura wore a simple dress of ivory cotton that Preston had insisted on buying for her, along with a delicate gold ring that had belonged to his mother. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through all the challenges and joys that life would bring, Laura felt the weight of years of self-doubt finally lift from her shoulders. The ranch became their shared home, and Laura threw herself into making it thrive. She started a vegetable garden that first spring, growing tomatoes and beans and squash that supplemented their meals and could be sold in Aurora for extra income. She learned to help with the ranch accounts, discovering she had a head for numbers that helped them plan for lean seasons and invest wisely in expanding their herd. But more importantly, she learned to accept Preston's love without questioning whether she deserved it. He showed her every day, in countless small ways, that she was cherished. He brought her wildflowers from the fields. He rubbed her shoulder on cold nights when it ached from the old injury. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions and listened thoughtfully to her ideas. He made her laugh with his dry humor and held her close on nights when memories of her parents brought grief. Their first child, a son they named Peter, arrived in the spring of 1880. Preston was beside himself with joy, cradling the tiny boy in his large, work-roughened hands with a gentleness that made Laura fall even more deeply in love with him. Watching him become a father, seeing the pride and tenderness in his eyes, she finally understood what it meant to be not just loved but treasured. "He has your eyes," Preston said one evening, rocking their son while Laura rested. "And your stubbornness," Laura replied with a smile, watching as Peter fussed until Preston adjusted him just so. "A useful trait for a rancher," Preston said, "though I hope he also inherits your courage and kindness." "He will have your integrity and strength," Laura said. "We will raise him to be a good man." 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth came into the world with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at being born. She was a force of nature from the start, demanding attention and affection in equal measure. Laura sometimes watched Preston with their children and marveled at the life they had built together. This family born from a chance encounter on a dusty Texas road. The ranch grew steadily over the years. With Laura's help managing the finances and Preston's skill with cattle, they were able to expand their holdings, hire additional workers, and become one of the more prosperous spreads in the region. But they never forgot where they had started, never took their blessings for granted. Laura made it a point to help other women who found themselves alone and struggling, offering work to widows who needed income and providing references for young women seeking positions in Aurora. She remembered too well what it felt like to believe yourself a burden, and she was determined that no one in her community would feel that way if she could help it. Preston supported her efforts wholeheartedly, often riding into town to pick up women who needed transport to the ranch for work or delivering payment, personally, to ensure they were treated with respect. Together, they became known not just as successful ranchers, but as people of genuine compassion and integrity. One evening in the summer of 1885, as they sat on the porch watching Peter, now 5, chase fireflies with his younger sister, Laura turned to Preston and said, "Do you remember what you told me that first day, when I said I was afraid of being a burden?" Preston smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "I told you that you were a blessing, and I meant it then just as I mean it now." "I never properly thanked you for that," Laura said, "for seeing something in me that I could not see in myself, for giving me the chance to become the person I was meant to be." "You gave me the same gift," Preston replied. "Before you arrived, I was just going through the motions of living. You reminded me what it means to truly love and be loved. You brought light and laughter into this house. You made it a home." Laura leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play in the gathering dusk. "We have built something good here." "We have built something extraordinary," Preston corrected gently. "And it all started because I happened to hear gunshots on a September afternoon and found the most remarkable woman I would ever meet bleeding in a stagecoach." "That is a rather dramatic beginning to our story," Laura said with a laugh. "All the best love stories are," Preston replied, kissing the top of her head. As the years passed, their family continued to grow. A second daughter, Anna, arrived in 1887, followed by another son, James, in 1890. The ranch house was expanded to accommodate their growing family, with new rooms added and the old porch rebuilt to wrap around the entire front of the house, providing ample space for watching sunsets and supervising the organized chaos of 4 energetic children. Peter grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father with the cattle. Elizabeth inherited her mother's head for numbers and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that made her formidable even at a young age. Anna was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing the horses and landscape around her. And James, the baby, was pure mischief from the moment he could crawl, keeping everyone on their toes. Laura sometimes thought about the woman she had been on that September day in 1878, broken and bleeding and convinced she had nothing to offer the world. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. She had been transformed not just by Preston's love, but by choosing to believe him when he called her a blessing, by having the courage to stay when every instinct told her to flee before she became too much trouble. Preston, too, had changed. The quiet, lonely rancher had blossomed into a devoted husband and father, a pillar of the Aurora community, and a man known throughout the region for his fairness and generosity. But the core of who he was remained the same, a man who saw the best in people and called it forth with his steady presence and unwavering support. In 1895, when Laura turned 37 and Preston was 42, They celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary with a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, filling the expanded house and spilling out onto the grounds. Margaret, now quite elderly but still spry, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. When Laura first arrived in Aurora, she was supposed to come live with me, Margaret said, raising her glass. I will confess I was a bit put out when Preston Irving swept in and stole her away before I even had a chance to meet her properly. But watching them together over these years, seeing the family they have built and the love they share, I cannot imagine things working out any better. To Laura and Preston, who prove that sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best thing that ever happened to you. To Laura and Preston, the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. That night, after all the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Laura and Preston walked out to the spot where they had first shared their feelings on the porch all those years ago. The old porch was gone now, replaced by the larger wraparound version, but the view was the same. Rolling hills bathed in moonlight, the sound of cattle lowing softly in the distance, the vast Texas sky scattered with stars. Do you ever wonder how different our lives would be if I had not ridden out that day? Preston asked, holding Laura close. I try not to, Laura admitted. It frightens me to think about. If you had been delayed, if you had ridden in a different direction, if you had decided it was not your concern. But I did ride out, Preston said firmly, and I found you and my whole life changed for the better. I do not believe in leaving things to chance, but I do believe that we make our own fate through the choices we make. I chose to help you. You chose to stay. Those choices led us here. To the best life I could have imagined, Laura said softly. You know, sometimes I think about that girl on the stagecoach, the one who truly believed she was worthless. And I wish I could go back and tell her everything that was waiting for her if she could just hold on a little longer, trust a little more. She found her way here, Preston said. That is what matters. Over the next several years, the Irving children grew into young adults. Peter took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing the same dedication and skill his father possessed. Elizabeth shocked everyone by announcing at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher, and with her parents' full support, attended a teacher's college in San Antonio before returning to Aurora to teach at the local schoolhouse. Anna discovered a talent for breeding and training horses, turning what had been a hobby into a profitable side business for the ranch. And James, true to form, kept everyone guessing about his future plans while charming his way through life. In 1903, Peter married a lovely young woman named Catherine who had moved to Aurora from Missouri. The wedding was held at the ranch, and Laura could not help but remember her own simple ceremony all those years ago. She was now 50 years old, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with years of laughter and sun. Preston, at 57, moved a bit slower than he once had, but his eyes still held the same warmth and strength that had captured her heart. We are getting old, Laura said as they watched Peter and Catherine dance their first dance as husband and wife. We are getting blessed, Preston corrected, pulling her into his arms. Every year with you has been a gift. Their first grandchild, a boy named Preston after his grandfather, arrived in 1904. Holding the tiny infant, Preston Sr. had tears in his eyes. I never dreamed, he said to Laura. When I was alone on this ranch, working every day just to get by, I never dreamed I would have all this. Neither did I, Laura whispered, looking around at their gathered family. Their 4 grown children, their new daughter-in-law, the tiny baby who represented the next generation. We are very lucky. Not lucky, Preston said, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago. Blessed. Elizabeth married a fellow teacher in 1906, and Anna wed a horse breeder from a neighboring ranch in 1908. James, ever the rebel, decided against ranching entirely and moved to Dallas to work as a journalist, though he visited home regularly and wrote long letters that kept the family updated on his adventures. As the years advanced and the 20th century brought changes to Texas, the Irving Ranch adapted while maintaining its core values. Preston eventually handed over primary operations to Peter, though he remained involved in major decisions and loved spending time teaching his grandchildren about cattle and horses and the land that had been his life's work. Laura, meanwhile, had become a beloved figure in Aurora, known for her charitable work and her open-door policy for anyone in need. Women still came to her seeking advice or assistance, and she never turned anyone away. She particularly loved working with young women who reminded her of herself, those who had been told they were burdens, who believed they had nothing to offer, who needed someone to see their potential and call it forth. "You are doing the same thing I did for you," Preston observed one day in 1912, watching as Laura counseled a young widow who had just arrived in town with nowhere to go. "You showed me the way," Laura replied. "Now I get to pass it on." In the summer of 1915, the Irving family gathered at the ranch to celebrate Preston and Laura's 40th wedding anniversary. All four of their children were there with their spouses. Peter and Catherine had given them 4 grandchildren. Elizabeth and her husband had 2. Anna had 3. Even James, the wanderer, had recently married and brought his new bride to meet the family. As Laura stood in the middle of the bustling household, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching Preston laugh at something Peter had said, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This life, this family, this love, it had all seemed so impossible once. She had been so certain that she was destined to be alone, unloved, merely tolerated at best. But Preston had shown her a different truth. He had looked at a wounded, penniless woman and seen not a burden but a blessing. And in doing so, he had given her the courage to become everything she was meant to be. That evening, after the party had wound down and most of the family had retired for the night, Preston found Laura sitting on the porch swing they had installed years ago. He settled beside her, the old wood creaking comfortably under their combined weight. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, taking her hand. "Everything," Laura said simply. "The stagecoach, the bandits, waking up in your house with a bullet wound and no idea what would happen next. Meeting you, falling in love, building this life. Our children, our grandchildren. 40 years, Preston, 40 years since you saved my life." "You saved mine too," Preston said quietly. "I was just too lonely and set in my ways to realize I needed saving. But you showed me what life could be when shared with someone you love. You gave me a family, a home that is more than just walls and a roof, a purpose beyond work and survival." Laura leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over 4 decades together. "Do you remember what I was most afraid of? Being a burden. It consumed me, the fear that I would be too much trouble, that I would wear out your kindness and patience. And do you remember what I told you? You said I was a blessing," Laura whispered. "And you kept saying it in 1,000 different ways until I finally believed it." "Because it was true then and it is true now," Preston said firmly. "You are the greatest blessing of my life, Laura Irving. You and the family we created together, the home we built, the love we share. None of it would exist without you." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The sounds of the ranch surrounded them, cattle settling for the night, horses whickering in the stable, the distant laughter of grandchildren being herded off to bed. It was a symphony of belonging, of family, of home. I would not change a single thing, Laura said finally. Not even the pain and loss that brought me here. Because it all led to you, to this life, to more happiness than I knew existed in the world. Neither would I, Preston agreed. Though I would have preferred the bandits not shoot you. Laura laughed, the sound bright and young despite her years. A fair point. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they remained on the porch swing, holding hands and counting their blessings. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical over their 40 years together. They had faced drought and disease among the cattle, economic downturns and personal losses, the everyday challenges of raising 4 strong-willed children and running a successful ranch. But through it all, the foundation Preston had laid that first day had held firm. He had seen her worth when she could not see it herself. He had called her a blessing when she believed herself a burden. And that single act of recognition, that refusal to let her diminish herself, had changed everything. In 1918, as the Great War finally ended and the world began to heal, Preston fell ill with pneumonia. It was a difficult winter, and despite the best efforts of the doctor from Aurora, now a young man who had taken over from the elderly physician who had treated Laura's gunshot wound all those years ago, Preston's health declined rapidly. Laura never left his side. She sat beside his bed day and night, holding his hand and reading to him from the Bible and books of poetry he loved. Their children took turns visiting, bringing grandchildren to cheer him, though everyone could see the shadow of grief growing in their eyes. One clear February morning, with sunlight streaming through the window and Laura's hand clasped in his, Preston opened his eyes and smiled at her. "There you are," he said, his voice weak but warm. "My blessing." "I am here," Laura said, tears streaming down her face. "I am always here." "I need you to promise me something," Preston said. "When I am gone, do not let yourself believe you are a burden again. Do not think of yourself as anything less than the extraordinary woman you are. You have blessed so many lives, Laura. Mine most of all. Promise me you will remember that." "I promise," Laura whispered. "But you are going to get better. You are too stubborn to let a little pneumonia take you down." Preston's smile widened slightly. "I have had a good life. No, a great life. More than I ever expected or deserved. I have been married to the love of my life for 43 years. I have 4 children who make me proud every single day. I have grandchildren who will carry our legacy forward. And I have you, still holding my hand, still loving me after all this time. If this is the end, I am at peace." "Preston, please," Laura begged, but she could see the light in his eyes beginning to fade. "Thank you," Preston said, each word an effort now. "For staying, for loving me, for being exactly who you are. You were never a burden, Laura. You were always a blessing. My blessing." Those were his final words. He closed his eyes and his breathing gradually stilled, and Laura sat holding his hand as the morning sun painted the room in gold, and the man who had saved her life, who had loved her unconditionally, who had shown her she was worthy of being loved, passed peacefully from the world. The grief was overwhelming. Laura felt as though a part of her soul had been torn away. But even in her deepest sorrow, she held on to Preston's final words, his final gift to her. She had promised not to forget her worth, and she intended to keep that promise. The ranch continued, now run primarily by Peter with help from his siblings. Laura remained in the house she had shared with Preston, surrounded by memories and family. She poured her energy into her grandchildren, into her community work, into preserving Preston's legacy of kindness and integrity. Years passed, and Laura found that while the acute pain of loss faded, her love for Preston never diminished. She spoke of him often to her grandchildren, telling them stories of their grandfather's goodness, his strength, his unwavering belief in seeing the best in people. "He saved grandmother from bandits," the children would say with awe, and Laura would smile. "He did more than that," she would tell them. "He saved me from myself. He taught me that being loved is not about earning it or being perfect or never needing help. He taught me that we are all blessings to each other when we choose to see each other clearly and love each other well." In 1928, on what would have been their 53rd wedding anniversary, Laura gathered her family at the ranch. She was now 70 years old, her body frail but her mind still sharp. All 4 of her children were there, along with their spouses, and a collection of grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. "I want to tell you all something," Laura said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "Your grandfather and I built something important here. Not just a successful ranch, though we did that. Not just a large family, though we are blessed with that as well. We built a legacy of love, of seeing value in each other, of refusing to let people diminish themselves." She looked at each of her children in turn, then at the younger generations listening with rapt attention. "Preston once told me I was a blessing when I believed I was a burden. That single statement changed my life. It gave me the courage to accept love, to build a family, to become the person I was meant to be. I want each of you to carry that forward. See the blessings in each other. Call them forth. Never let anyone you love believe they are less than precious." "We will, Mama," Elizabeth said, speaking for all her siblings. "We promise." Laura lived another 6 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1934 at the age of 76. She was laid to rest beside Preston on a hill overlooking the ranch, the place they had built together from hope and hard work and unshakable love. The Irving Ranch continued to thrive under Peter's management and eventually passed to his children and grandchildren. But more than land and cattle, what endured was the story of Preston and Laura, the cowboy who saw a blessing where others might have seen a burden, and the woman who found the courage to believe him. Their story was told and retold at family gatherings, a reminder that love is not about perfection or convenience, but about seeing clearly and choosing kindness, about calling forth the best in each other, and refusing to let fear or doubt diminish what is possible. And in the small cemetery on the hill, 2 headstones stood side by side. One read, Preston Irving, 1851–1918, beloved husband and father. The other said, Laura Emerson Irving, 1858–1934, forever his blessing. The wind blew across the Texas hills, carrying the scent of wildflowers and cattle and earth. The sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold. And the legacy of a love that began with a single act of kindness continued on, generation after generation, a testament to the transformative power of seeing worth in others, and the courage it takes to believe you are worthy of being loved. Their great-great-grandchildren still worked the land, still gathered on that same porch to watch the sunset, still told the story of how it all began with a wounded woman, a compassionate man, and the simple truth that changed everything. You are not a burden. You are a blessing. And in those words, echoed across decades and generations, the love of Preston and Laura Irving lived on, eternal and undiminished, a light in the darkness for anyone who had ever feared they were too much trouble, too broken, too lost to be loved. Their story proved that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with someone seeing you not as you fear you are, but as you are truly meant to be, and loving you enough to help you become that person. The ranch stood as a monument to that truth, prosperous and full of life, a place where family gathered and love flourished, where the legacy of one cowboy's kindness and one woman's courage continued to bless the world, just as they had blessed each other on that September day in 1878 when their lives collided on a dusty Texas road and changed forever.